wow. Is this good? All right. I'm just so delighted to look across this room and see so many old friends. Yeah, old, maybe the word. And to listen to the piper, it means so much, and I'll explain why in a minute. And thank you to the distinguished professors and others who got dressed up to do this wonderful piece of pageantry. It means so much. Let's see. Oh, can I read this? So thank you all for coming for this lovely event that I hope we will have some fun remembering Bernie at. And I'll look in here. It means so much to me and to the rest of our family that you're all here, so I appreciate that. I want to explain about the bagpipes, because you may be wondering, what's a nice little Jewish guy from Brooklyn doing with bagpipes at his memorial? And the answer is not that it became a fad, which it did, but that we spent the first year of our marriage in Scotland. We were seniors in college when Bernie was awarded the Fulbright Fellowship to go to the University of Edinburgh. And we lived there, well, let's see, we graduated, took a quick trip up to Niagara Falls, came back. He went to his mother's house, I went to my father's house, we packed our bags, and the next thing we were on a ship, the SS United States, because that's how the government sent you in those days, to Southampton, and ended up spending a year in Scotland. So we developed a love for bagpipes. And years later, when it did become a thing to have bagpipes at funerals and other similar events, Bernie said, I want that. So he got that. All right, with this light like this, I can't see what I wrote. So just a minute, I know I have more things to say. Yes. So he spent the year there studying Scottish common sense philosophy, which the most well-known representative of that field is David Hume. After a year, we went back and he started his studies at Columbia. But imagine his delight when some years. It was 1964 that we sailed off to Scotland. In 1976, after he had been here for a while, he got a letter inviting him as a renowned Hume scholar to go back to Edinburgh for the bicentennial of David Hume. So I thought I'd share that. Most of you know him mostly as an animal philosopher, but prior to that, he was doing the real thing that philosophers think should be done. So back we went to Scotland for the Hume bicentennial, where he read a paper, and then we were feted at partied at the famous castle in Edinburgh. And as we entered let me get us there first. The cab driver who drove us to Edinburgh Castle asked why we were going, and we explained. And he turned to Bernie and he said, "You must be proud of every drop of Scottish blood that's in you." At the event itself, we were piped in, and that doesn't mean we were shoved in through a pipe, but rather a piper piped each set of people in. Dr. and Mrs. Rollin arrived, and it was quite a treat. I hope you're enjoying the slideshow that got put together, and I hope you will enjoy listening to many people talk about Bernie tonight. I should mention that I did get a note asking that no one speak for longer than 3 minutes, and I know I've already done more, because they said, what was the word they used? University leadership didn't want this to last more than an hour. Do you hear it? I know you do, and I know you're hearing exactly what I heard, which was the administrators can go. So, Rabbi is going to speak next, and then we'll hear some good stories. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda and Michael, for honouring me to come and share some words, share some reflections on Bernie. How is it that a Orthodox, devout Jew rabbi from Australia and a militantly atheist Jew from Brooklyn become good friends? And I want to share today a little bit about Bernie that perhaps you didn't know or perhaps you did know. I'm not going to focus on the things that you do know, but I want to share something about Bernie that created that friendship that I think will be a lasting inspiration to us. I mean, we all know about how colourful Bernie was as an individual, as a character. He brings a smile to everybody's face just when you recall his memory. And I'll tell you this, Linda and Michael, I think about him almost every day, and I want to tell you why. Bernie was a true friend of mine. That's a big deal for me to say. We all know that Bernie's academic achievements and abilities were on the level of a genius. We all know about Bernie's build like a Sherman tank, but he had the height of a Brooklyn Jew. We all know about Bernie's distinct look as a modern philosopher with the beard, the glasses. We all know about his mouth, the mouth of a sailor. Heard about it many a time. The very varied interests that he had, and in everything that he did that he excelled. That we all know. And that's without getting into the bodybuilding and the motorcycle and the Scottish ensemble. That was a new thing for me, Linda, but I'm not surprised. I remember when I came out here 20 years ago, I was a young, fairly inexperienced rabbi. I was in my 20s. I had grey hair, so people took me a little more seriously, but I had no idea what I was doing. And one of the first people that I met was Bernie. Why? Because if you asked in town, so I'm looking for the Jewish people, all paths really ended up at Bernie's door. And I remember meeting him for the first time, and I don't know who was more surprised, myself or him. The questioning was along the lines of, what are you doing out of Brooklyn? How'd you get here? And in a very short amount of time, we became not just close friends, but he became my biggest supporter. Bernie was a militant atheist, there's no question about it. Yet he was full of surprises. When I came to direct the funeral service at Linda's request, even though I knew the answer, I said, "Linda, what gives? Why would an atheist ask a rabbi to lead their service?" And she said to me, which is so classical Bernie always said, just in case, and that includes many just in case, make sure the rabbi's there, just in case there is a God, right? It's humorous, but it's very powerful at the same time. I would actually tell this to Bernie, and I was looking through my emails last night. There was barely a month where I didn't communicate with Bernie before he got sick. I told Bernie a joke because I told him he really reminds me of this joke, and I shared it with him, and he actually agreed. I said there was a Jewish man on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, near where Bernie grew up, and he, like Bernie, was a militant atheist. And as such, he refused to send his son to a Jewish school, but he decided to send him to the Catholic school. They had a good education. And one day, the son comes back home and he tells Dad, very excitedly, he says, "Dad, guess what? We learnt about the Trinity today, the Father, the Holy Ghost, the Spirit." And his father got very upset, the Jewish father, and he says, "Listen to me, son. There's only one God, and we don't believe in him." This was Bernie. He actually didn't argue with that. Right in the early years, there was a young lady that came up to me. She came to complain about Bernie, which probably wasn't the first or the last time by any stretch. Bernie always reminded me of Don Rickles. It's an older crowd. When I talk about Don Rickles to my students, they have never heard of him. Don Rickles, right? He wouldn't have lasted in today's era. And I don't know how far Bernie would have gone. So this young lady got very offended. Why? She was probably the only Jewish student in his class. And during the class, Bernie said, "I want to ask you all a favour, never marry a Jewish girl." Now, I tried to reassure this young lady that, look, he was joking. I mean, she was very upset, and she said, "Look, I felt like disappearing, I was traumatised, etc." I said, "Look, let me speak to Bernie, let's see if we can clarify this." And I went and spoke to Bernie, and he said, "Rabbi, that's ridiculous. Of course I was joking. I married a Jewish girl. How was I meant to know that there was one Jewish kid in the class?" Where am I going with this? When Bernie saw me, and he saw that I represented something very contrary to his belief system and his way of behaving, it never entered into the equation. I do not recall ever or at all discussing theology with him, discussing belief in God. We connected both on a brotherhood level. We were both Jewish people. But more importantly, we connected because of what I call the distinguishing feature of Bernie's personality. Something that from a distance you didn't necessarily see. Something that I say, as rare and as unique as all his qualities were, this is even more rare and unique, and it's something that's even more needed today. Whoever these leaders are, Linda, that expect us to stay to 3 minutes, I can't repeat the words that Linda told me that Bernie said, but I share the sentiments, because this is what Bernie would have wanted. So, Bernie had extraordinary gifts of empathy. You may agree, you may disagree, but this is what I saw. Which means when I first came out here 20 years ago, I was an anomaly. I was, a walking advertisement for Fiddler on the Roof. Wherever I would go, perfect strangers would come up to me and say, "Shalom." Like you try to elicit a response from a parrot, "Polly, want a cracker?" Even though I speak a fairly good English. Been treated like an exotic species, if you like. I remember I was in King Soopers once, and a tall gentleman with a cowboy hat, he's looking at me, and I'm like, "Here it comes," and he walks over him and he's like, "Are you a Hebrew?" The moment I saw Bernie, he connected and embraced me for the individual that was behind the belief system, behind the rituals, behind the attire, despite the fact that he wouldn't abide by my theology. I cannot tell you how many times it's been my experience and true of others, and we see that in a very divided and divisive world, where if you're on the different political spectrum, let alone religious, let alone sexual, whatever it may be, you won't even associate with that person. We see that far too much. Bernie was my friend. Bernie helped me extraordinarily in my early years here, where I was trying to figure it out. And when you try to figure it out, you try to make mistakes. Because Bernie had a huge heart. If you looked into those eyes, you saw extraordinary sensitivity. Sure, there was this tremendous bluster, almost like an aggression. And that was actually his name. His Hebrew name is Dov, right, Linda? Dov in Hebrew means bear. I mean, that's what he was. He was a bear of a man. But he was a cuddly teddy bear. Deep down, he was a cuddly teddy bear. And when I say he was my true friend, while Fort Collins was trying to figure me out, Bernie accepted me. Bernie loved me. He guided me. He always had a positive word for me. He knew how to boost your ego. He knew how to write you emails. You're doing a great job, Yerachmel. Keep it going. At the same time, he didn't believe in a word I was doing. But that was fine. He supported me. And I'll never forget that friendship. I'll never forget how much that meant to me. I still think of him now. We would sometimes have long conversations. He had a way of listening to you, despite the fact that he enjoyed sharing as well. He had a way of validating you. He had a way of making you feel important for the person that you were, and not for the human flaws that you may have. To me, as I think about all the things that Bernie stands for, it's a lesson that I take, and I want to encourage each and every one of you. Can you imagine a world where we do not focus on the person's appearance, colour of skin, immersion in any other form of politics, etc., but just got to the core of that human being? You'll imagine Bernie, and he touched my life, and I'll be forever grateful for that. So Bernie, as the Jewish belief is that you're up there listening or laughing or telling us to shut up, I don't know. I thank you. You have tremendous love. You've created an extraordinary legacy, not just for the animal kingdom, but for humanity. It's well known, and I share this with Bernie. Some of the greatest Jewish leaders like Moses and King David were selected to lead the people because they showed their compassion for animals. These things are not unrelated. Continue to love and take care of your loved ones, Michael and Linda and the entire family, the grandchildren, etc., right? And continue to, from up there, just in case there's a God and spirituality, send that love to everyone you've been connected to, and hopefully we'll try to step into your footsteps and in your image and continue to create that incredible love and non-judgmental acceptance that you have. Thank you, and may you and Linda and Michael and all the kids have only happy occasions and happy memories to share going forward. Thank you for having me. God bless.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rick Miranda. I'm serving this year as the interim president of the university, and it's my honor to be here at this ceremony. I can't match the rabbi's eloquence and his ability to capture some of the essence of his relationship with Bernie, but I did meet with Bernie a bunch over the years and here and there. And actually, you know, my first interactions with the Rollin family was with Linda. Linda taught in the mathematics department when I arrived here 40 years and 15 days ago. And we were colleagues in the math department. She went on to teach the logic courses in philosophy for many decades after that, and been colleagues ever since. I got to know Bernie more when I was in the provost's office. In a few meetings we had related to thorny issues, in the IRB and with Terry Engel and Matt Hickey, the vice presidents for research at the time. Things don't rise up to the provost's office unless someone lower down can't solve them. So they were tricky issues, and Bernie definitely cut through with his opinions on things. And it was when I got to know him and realized what an asset he was to the institution and to the whole profession. He was here 5 decades, taught the first ever course in veterinary medical ethics, and he was, as you heard, internationally regarded as the father of medical ethics in the veterinary profession. Thousands of articles. Think of that, thousands of articles. I mean, how long does it take you to write an article? Right? So he was as prolific as Bach, who wrote a hymn every day, right? So it was like that. Mentored countless students and counseled them over the decades. Lifetime Achievement Award for Excellence in Research Ethics from Public Responsibility Medicine and Research Organization. He told you what he really thought when you met him, right? There was no holding back. He was not a huge mystery in that sense. On the other hand, he was a guy from the East Coast who somehow made his life in the West here. And he was a person who was deeply involved in the welfare of animals, but from a very human perspective. He was a bodybuilder, I guess, and he had the body to prove it. But his most important muscle was up in his head. And he was short, but he was a giant, right? You know what I mean? So you can think of these as contradictions. I don't think of them so much as contradictions in Bernie's case. I think of them as more that Bernie lived in a world, and these were opposite poles maybe on Bernie's planet, and he was able to visit almost every part of that world one way or another and make sense out of it. You would never say he was a man of contradiction. He knew. He had a vision. He knew what he was about, and that worked for him, and it worked for all of us too, who knew him and worked with him. And like I said, he told you what he really thought when you met with him. If you agreed with him, okay, that was I suppose a good thing. If you disagreed with him, I think he enjoyed that even more. Because that's when, the conversation would involve words that will begin with an unnamed letter that we've made reference to before. And that was always a lively conversation. Perhaps above all, he lived his values every day. You sense that from what Rabbi Orlik was talking about. He spoke truth to power. No question about that. Even the 3-minute thing, he would have. Yeah. By the way, that wasn't me. Don't pin that on me. I mean, I don't know. This probably goes back to President Austin or something, those rules. Who knows? Maybe President Morgan. Anyway, he fought for the vulnerable. He loved his family and teaching with a passion that few can match. And he was more than a treasured colleague. He was a great friend to so many people at this university. He was one of a kind. We were so fortunate as a community here at the campus and in Fort Collins to have him as our colleague for so many decades. Wherever you are, Bernie, thank you very much. And thanks, Linda, for sharing him with us.
So yes, hello, I'm Ben Withers, I'm Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, and I'm not responsible for the 3-minute rule either. So it's a great pleasure to be here today. I got to know Bernie late in his career here, and Linda too. I want to acknowledge her contributions to the College of Liberal Arts as well. The two of them together served this university for 99 years. So Linda. So I got to know Bernie in a couple of ways. One, when I was hired to be dean here in 2016, I came from outside the university, and as a historian, I wanted to know everything that I could about the college and about its excellence faculty. So I got to know Bernie through that Lifetime Achievement Award that he got in 2016, the one that Rick mentioned. And I got to know him through that virtual introduction as one of the country's foremost animal ethics experts, and an expert in veterinary medicine, in addition to be an outstanding philosopher. I got to know him through that virtual conversation that we had through that article as someone who had a profound impact on many people in the university. So it was a surprise to me a little bit later that summer when I had an appointment on my calendar from Professor Bernie Rollin. I'm going, wow, here's a proactive person. Someone wanted to come in and get to know the new dean. It wasn't until the rabbi's conversation today that I really realized what he was up to. And that is, he didn't believe in deans either. So he was coming to make sure that I was real. So he walks into the room, and the rabbi's description of him as a bear is apt. I'm sitting in my office. People who've been in there know it's kind of a short, narrow office, and here comes in this bear of a man who basically fills the office with his physical presence and also with this profound intellect that was evident from our first conversations. He was so smart that one of the first things that he told me was that now infamous story about his interaction with some ranchers in Kiowa, Colorado, where basically it was an unreceptive audience, and he, as a Brooklynite, challenged them to walk outside to a one-on-one, mano-a-mano contest to see who would be able to control that room. I realized that what he was doing perhaps there was making sure that I knew that he was on the faculty. And I'm really happy that he didn't challenge me to a fist fight at that time. To say his language was colorful is an understatement. He used many of those colorful words with me in conversations, always to a productive end. I always listened when the words turned into that direction, believe me. But what I want to mention today is a little bit more about his impact on this institution. We know the kind of man he was. We know his contributions. You can see his many publications translated into Japanese and Spanish and Portuguese and others. But I want to remind you that Bernie came to this institution in 1969. That was basically about a decade after President Morgan convinced the Board of Agriculture that we were going to change from A&M College to a university. Now, as Shakespeare might say, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, but not an A&M until you turn it into something that includes the humanities and the social sciences. So Bernie was part of an infusion of faculty in the late 1960s. It included luminaries like Lauren Crabtree, who later became Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and later Provost, Chancellor at Knoxville, John Strayer, for whom our Center for Public Service Leadership is named. Holmes Ralston came 1 year before Bernie. And what strikes me about that is that investment in the fabric of the university. So we built the area around Clark and Morgan and Laurie at that time to transform that A&M college into a university. And we populated those spaces with people like Bernie who would fill them with ideas and connections with students. So two simple things about that. One, first, another famous story is that he developed that course in animal ethics as a result of a conversation he had in one of the campus gyms, where a faculty member from the College of Vet Med said, "Hey, we don't have anything like that. Could you teach something?" Then Bernie, true to his nature, said, "Yeah, I'll give it a shot." In doing that, he realized that there wasn't a textbook for the course. So what did he do? He wrote it. That textbook in that class, that attention to students, turned into a world-shaking area of study for him that transformed the ancient discipline of philosophy. So this institution, through the creation of the fabric, hiring of people like Bernie, had a tremendous impact not only on this institution, but the world too. The second thing is to go back to our land-grant mission. We know that the Morrill Act says we are here to provide a liberal and practical education for the industrial classes of the United States. Liberal and practical, to think and to do, to be profound and pragmatic. And that's what Bernie was. His profound thought was simply to ask, are we being ethical people if we mistreat animals around us? What is good? What is bad? What is a positive action and what is a negative? The pragmatic aspect of that is that we now look at the way that animals give births on farm differently, the way they live their lives, the way they suffer pain or do not suffer pain, the way that we treat our beloved household pets too, he had an impact on. Profound and pragmatic. So with that in mind, I want to leave you with just a few words of Bernie's. This is one, again, that I found in one of those online publications. He says, quote, "The biggest compliment you can give a philosopher is to say they made you think and they remember that stuff. That's the proof for me that it's not just ass kissing." So Bernie, right? So I'm blessed. I get to fight for the things that can't, and I get to fight against the things that can. So thank you for this opportunity to remember Bernie with you today.
Thank you, William. So now we go and start basically a speeches by people who like to share memories about that. So the first person on the list is Paul Rollin.
Linda and Mike, it's such a good thing to see you again. I know you so well from the stories I was told and shared with this fabulous friend. My connection with Bernie is outside the CSU universe. I want to talk a little bit about him there, but I'm emotional about him because he was a dear friend for all the reasons so wonderfully articulated, and that helps me understand why I have such a love for him. I don't think I'll ever walk a day in my life without him. There was a person from the literary realm who, in commenting on someone else's dying, said, what a thing is the mind with integrity that has dispassionate motives. When I was around Bernie, I've learned not only that irreverence could become a very reverent thing, but that critical thinking was something that motivated all of us. Coming from outside the CSU world, and I was at Tufts at the time I met him, spent a lot of time at Harvard, and we did a lot of conferences together, particularly on the animal issues. Bernie, just through asking the most basic questions in the most human way, the rabbi brought across so beautifully how human he was and how much of a community maker he was. Those extraordinary qualities went so far in the academic world because they're often lacking, and because he carried a kind of integrity without having to insist on his point of view, but also bringing out yours. And when you shared it with all of yourself, self-deprecatingly sometimes, confidently other times. But if I learned anything about him, it's that there is something in challenging others with love, as he so well did, that brings out the best of us such that we can self-actualize. So with his extraordinary gifts in mind, his wide range, his ability not only to impact this community has been described so well, but so many other communities. I know literally dozens and dozens of major academics who are as fully indebted to Bernie as I am. And I want to say to the two of you again, thank you for sharing with us. Also to CSU, thank you for sharing him and giving him that platform and letting him do all the things that he's done. He has enriched us. And so I think it's true that everybody in the world today walks further, better, and possibly more happily because of this person's deep skills at being human, humble, and irreverent in a very reverent way. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. So now I'm going to ask you a little bit back in time, because even if I was giving this a very nice list, I'd skip the comic play.
So Dean, not exactly correct, Executive Associate Dean. So the Dean of the College of Veterinary Medicine, and I wasn't necessarily feeling so important that I speak, but I felt it's very important the College of Veterinary Medicine have a presence here today, given the impact that Bernie had on that college and, in fact, the entire profession. So our new dean, Dean Sue Vanderwood, unfortunately could not be here today, and she had a prior engagement that was actually in Scotland, so she's not in Edinburgh, but in Glasgow, and had to attend to that, but she certainly sends her wishes and best thoughts, both as a UDP, a colleague, and the Dean of the College of Veterinary Medicine. So raises a question then, who am I and why am I here? Some of you probably remember that from a presidential debate many years ago. So name is Colin Clay, and Sue Vanderwood actually started as dean almost exactly 3 weeks ago, and coincidentally, almost exactly 3 weeks ago, I stepped out of the role of interim dean of the College of Veterinary Medicine and back into this executive associate role. So that's why I'm up here today. Also say that it's a bit daunting to speak to and about a really a larger-than-life figure, and particularly in a room that is well populated with larger-than-life figures. And for somebody that doesn't necessarily have a great deal of self-confidence, I can't tell you how nice it feels to be up here and have that opportunity. So, you know, I was thinking about what to speak to today, and I don't know why, but something came to me from the Lord of the Rings movies. At the beginning, it was talking about how the most unlikely of creatures, a hobbit from the Shire, could change the course of history. And not that I would compare Bernie by any stretch of the imagination to a hobbit. He's not small. And my understanding that hobbits are quiet and retiring and content to have the rest of the world leave them alone. So certainly none of those things capture Bernie, but I think the most unlikely of creatures kind of captures a point here. And the rabbi sort of spoke to this. And if you think about what the veterinary profession looked like in 1969, and in fact into the 70s, it was very much a white, male-dominated profession, and at least here in Colorado, most of these folks came from ranches and rural parts of Colorado. And then on the scene comes a bearded philosopher, Jewish philosopher from Brooklyn, New York, that is not only going to ultimately confront a profession, but lead it entirely new ways of thinking about what they do and their role in promoting animal welfare. And so how did he do this? With all of the qualities that people have spoken to: intellect, humor, force of reason, confrontation, mediation, argument, discourse, dialogue, meeting people where they're at, and always making us challenge our own core beliefs and assumptions, and at the same time making us better. So in the end, people who spoke to this, you don't have to agree with Bernie. He damn sure made you confront yourself and articulate your views, not based on some historical precedent or some metaphysical or transcendent sense of right and wrong, but on the very imminent application of ethics, not as a philosophical construct, but as a way to treat all living things. So now maybe that doesn't sound transformative to newer generations of physicians, scientists, and veterinarians, but I can assure you it was. He was a force that truly created a paradigm shift and created an entirely new field of veterinary medical ethics. And point out that this shift was grounded in the notion that thought cannot be separated from action, and in fact should drive action. So Bernie's ethics were an applied ethics that consistently challenged us to ask who or what is included or excluded from his words, the moral arena, and most importantly, why. And I might all just backtrack here for 1 second. We've sort of talked about the veterinary profession, ranching, and these were two groups that certainly Bernie interacted with and had a profound influence on. But let me also say that in general, folks that are in the business of animal production for either food or fiber are not typically people that are going to be abusing animals. In fact, animal husbandry is quite central, all right, to having a healthy herd or healthy population. Even those folks can deal with animals in a competition sort, rodeo, racing, whatever. Again, in all these places, they're gray areas, all right? But these were folks that were probably receptive, in fact, were receptive to the idea that animals are part of the moral arena. Where I think Bernie ultimately perhaps had one of the greatest impacts was animals in the laboratory setting. Okay, so you think about it, in 1981, when he published his first book on animal or human morality and animal ethics, there was no institutional review of laboratory animal protocols. There was a USDA review of facilities, but there was no review of the experimentation or what was actually taking place in an investigator's laboratory. So the Animal Welfare Act that was amended in 1986 was a direct result of Bernie Rollin and the oversight that we so desperately needed and now take for granted in the use of animals in science and, in fact, in education as well. Now, just a second, I use the term paradigm shift, and that's a phrase that's borrowed from another philosopher named Thomas Kuhn in a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And I bring that up not just because it's a good book and provocative, but it was assigned to me by Bernie. So I'm going to make a little paradigm shift here myself and speak for a moment not to the profound impact and legacy of Bernie in veterinary medical ethics, but rather the profound impact that Bernie had on me, not just as a colleague and a friend, but in fact very much a teacher and a mentor. And so go back in time almost 40 years. It's when I started my PhD work here at Colorado State University. And at that time there was a requirement for PhD candidates to have not just, of course, their primary discipline, but also to have a minor. So, and these could range anywhere from mathematics to history to engineering, whatever. So when I started, I was well aware of Bernie Rollin. I'd never met the man. I did read his book, his first book, published in 1981. So I thought, well, maybe philosophy, maybe Bernie would agree to serve on my committee. So I asked a fellow named Jim Voss, some of you might know Dr. Voss, what he thought if I would do philosophy as a minor, and what he would thought about me asking Bernie Rollin to serve on my PhD committee. Now, again, I'd never met Bernie before, so I called him. This was before email, right? So telephone call, he said, sure, I'll talk to you. And so agreed to meet at the Laurie Student Center over some coffee, and I didn't know what he looked like. This was before Google. You couldn't just look up somebody and see their image. So I asked Jim Voss, and I didn't call him Jim at the time, Dr. Voss, so what does he look like? And Dr. Voss stopped for a second and said, well, if you can imagine Jesus as a leader of a biker gang, then you've got a pretty good image. So I was able to pick him out right off the bat. So Bernie agreed to serve in my committee, and in fact, that book by Thomas Kuhn, the one he had signed, serves as a basis for questions in my prelims. I remember this distinctly in the summer, and honestly, I think it was 84, but it might have been 85. Bernie and I met together every Thursday morning for about 2 hours, again in the Laurie Student Center, to talk about that book, all right? And he would assign the reading, and I'd come, and we would discuss it. It was amazing. So, you know, it opened my mind as an emerging scientist that science is not simply a linear accumulation of data and facts, but profoundly shaped by external forces that include social forces, economic forces, art, all right, and of course ethics. And the latter is unequivocally true. I mean, whether we thought about it or not, as scientists, as a group, we would also often say to ourselves, there's some things we just won't do because they're wrong. Well, what Bernie would ask is, why? How did you reach the conclusion that that's wrong, but this other thing that you're doing is okay? Really, back to the question of what does the moral arena encompass? So, I finished my PhD and went off to Cleveland, Case Western Reserve University, to learn molecular biology. About 6 years later, I returned to CSU to interview for a faculty position, and the front row at my seminar was Bernie. And of course, he asked the first question, and it was a question based on a rather obscure passage in a book by Doug Adams, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. This was about a species of bovine-like creatures called Amygdalian major cow that actually have a strong desire to be eaten. And so this led to a question of Bernie of if we could engineer animals that perhaps didn't want to be eaten, but didn't care. So they were decerebrate, if we will. Would that be right, if we could do that from a genetic engineering standpoint? So that kicked off an interesting conversation in my interview, not exactly the direction I thought I was going to return to. Well, skip a little bit. I got the job in 1992, and Bernie had always said when I returned, let's teach a course together in science and ethics, and so I kind of put that off for a while, and finally, I think it was about 1997, we did a course called PLCC 130, his philosophy class. He was not easily deterred. If that was something he chose to do and wanted me to do it, I was probably going to do it. I got to say it was as much fun as I've ever had in a class. In a moment, that course could almost seamlessly shift from, you know, a Kantian idea of the categorical imperative and John Stuart Mill's and utilitarianism to the biological barriers to genetically engineered germ cells versus somatic cells. Fascinating class. We did that for 6 or 7 years, and like with a lot of things, other obligations take place, and for both of us, and that there's also changes in core curriculum at that time, and that class didn't continue. I do cherish those times, though, with Bernie in the classroom. That's where he really could shine. It was just amazing to watch that man. Over the years, I guess, like many things, our times together grew less frequent, but whenever I saw that Bernie called, I always knew that it was going to be interesting. I always knew that it was going to be compelling, and I also knew that it was going to be a call for me to do something, even if I didn't freaking want to do it. So I don't know how common it is, and I suspect pretty common, that some of us are lucky enough to know people that change us and at their best help us to be better, wiser, and at their very best more compassionate. And Bernie was one of those people to me, and I suspect to many others here. It's because of folks like Bernie that I've never entirely accepted the concept that everyone is replaceable. Let me also just say that in terms of my professional trajectory, Bernie had a profound impact. And at one point in particular, where I thought I was going to walk away from a PhD program, I got into sort of a disagreement with a very prominent individual. I can say who it is because it didn't end up badly, Bill Pickett. So I called Bernie and said, I'm done, I'm out of here. And Bernie said, you can't do that. And I said, well, yeah, I can. He said, well, can I reason with you? I said, I'm not sure you can. And he said, well, that word, that, I'm just going to come over and kick your ass. He said, don't think I'm kidding. So I decided to stick with it, and that's why I'm up here today. So thank you, everyone, and thank you so much for Bernie.
Now, I wasn't sure what to expect up here, so I kept mine till about 3 minutes, 4 minutes, because I figured there might be like a bouncer sitting back here and would throw me off the stage, kind of like Bernie would do. My name's Tom Edling. I really had the pleasure of knowing Bernie as a teacher, a mentor, professional colleague, and most importantly, he was a really close friend. I met Bernie about 30 years ago here at CSU in the vet school in his animal ethics class. As you all know, better than anybody, by the time students get to like the graduate professional level courses, they're really competent at reading, comprehension. They can relay information back to you on a test. They know the right answers. Bernie didn't care about any of that. He didn't want the right answer. He wanted your answer. And it was only yours if you could support it. So he made you think. Bernie encouraged students to develop a thought process and come up with their own answers, which to a lot of people is really uncomfortable. It's the first time they had to do that. To me, it was very beneficial because he forced us to develop our own ethic toward animals, forced us to think about it. A lot of us hadn't thought about that before. But we also had to be able to support it and discuss it. So professionally, I'm here to represent American Humane. Our CEO, Robin Gandrick, wasn't able to be here because she, like many, is recovering from COVID right now. She wanted me to convey her deep regard and appreciation for Bernie because he served for over 10 years on our scientific advisory committees, including the iconic No Animals Are Harmed Hollywood program, the Pet Industry Audit Program, and the Airline Pet Transportation Program. His influence was invaluable. I was also very fortunate to work with Bernie when I worked for a large pet corporation. Back in the early 2000s, several of us put together an independent animal care advisory committee, kind of like an IACUC for the pet industry. And we did that for the company we worked for. And Bernie served on that for about 15 years. During that time, Bernie and other really influential people, really great people on that committee helped improve and shape the way animals are treated in the pet industry. He had a tremendous and positive impact on the pet industry and animals and entertainment. I think a lot of people don't realize about him. So I've got to tell a story. I think this one, in my mind, really epitomizes Bernie. So this pet corporation I worked with had a yearly managers meeting where all the store managers would come together along with all the corporate leaders, and that was about 2,000 people in attendance, big crowd. Bernie was chosen to be the keynote speaker at the event, which he loved speaking to crowds of people, especially people that loved animals. Because Bernie had been on the Animal Advisory Committee for several years, and as we all know, his penchant for colorful language is very well known, the senior VP of Human Resources was somewhat concerned. She envisioned there would be several HR complaints after the event. So I asked Bernie if he might be able to tone it down just a little bit so I could keep my job. And he smiled, and that smile of his, and said, "Yeah, I'll see what I can do." We know what that meant, too. So everything was going great. The talk was about over. He talked for about 20 minutes. And then Bernie decided to tell a joke about a hooker. Yeah, he did. I was watching the senior VP of HR standing over there, her eyes widened. She got this really grimace look on her face. She dropped her head. And as the joke ended and Bernie gave his final remarks, the entire event hall erupted in applause. They all stood up and gave Bernie a standing ovation. And I was at these events for almost 18 years. That never happened any time. Bernie was the only one that ever got a standing ovation from all these people. And there were no HR complaints. That was Bernie. Over the years, Bernie and I shared numerous phone calls like a lot of you all talked about. And it was about whatever was on our mind. We would just call and talk to each other. It was great. Those are probably some of the most impactful phone calls I've ever had with anybody. whenever Bernie was in town, he and Linda and I would go out to dinner, usually at the Taj Mahal restaurant, where Michael worked as a youngster. We had great conversations and really great fun together. So in closing, I'd like to share some of Bernie's wisdom. He once told me that when you're in a discussion with someone about how an animal should be treated, if they're a good person, you don't have to try to convince them of what the right thing to do is. All you have to do is remind them of what they already know. You know, Bernie made the world a better place. He made me a better person. I miss him every day. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Tom. So the next speaker is David.
I usually have a graduate student to figure out how to get this thing going right, but bear with me just 1 minute here. My name is David Crocker. I came to CSU in 1966, taught the history of philosophy, and 3 years later, I handed the baton of the class over to Bernie Rollin. From there on, we were great friends, and he and others of us forged a new model for doing philosophy. I want to talk about friendship and about that new approach to philosophy. So many people have already talked about friendship. It seems to be not only something I experienced, but something that so many of you have experienced. Aristotle talked about friendship in a way that many of us learn from. In the business world, there are friends, each trying to get as much as they can from the other without giving up very much. But Aristotle identified another kind of friendship, a kind of friendship based on equality, a mutuality, where you gain something, but one of your basic ends is to benefit your friend. Bernie benefited many friends in many ways. You won't believe this, but Bernie was a runner. Although his run was about 1/4 of a mile before the real workout, which is lifting weights. But he looked at me in 1974, after coming back from a year in Germany. You got to start working out. You've got to start running, and I'm going to teach you how to do it. So outside of Moby Gym, which had a little course that he ran 1/4 of a mile, I followed him around that course. And I made it, and I was proud of myself, and he was really proud of me as well. Little did he know that that would start a life of running, 3 marathons, always behind another person here who's going to talk, and that's Neil Petrie, who ran Boston, and we were all proud of him. I didn't. Oh, I lost it again. But that's an example of him thinking of other people who he counts as his friends. But one aspect that didn't come out in relation to friendship that I think is also part of being a friend of Bernie, and that is fun. No, more than that, pranks. No, more than that, dirty tricks. Now, I can't give you the classical example of Bernie and dirty tricks, except to mention the name of Hannah Arendt. Some of you will know that there was a trick that he played on me that is world famous. And I must say that every time it's mentioned, I crawl into a corner. But I did threaten Bernie afterwards, okay, you got me this time. Your whole life, you're going to be under the possibility of a trick on you from me that makes up for that. I never could come up with anything. I tried once. Bernie had a class in philosophy in, I think it was room 224 of the, what's now called the Eddy Building. And I had a class right afterwards. And he would leave his scribblings and writings, which were not always easy to read, on the blackboard. And my class would come in afterwards. So my challenge each day was to try to construct a lecture out of Bernie's notes on the blackboard. But then the class got an idea. Why don't we try to get a trick on Bernie? So 5 minutes before his class ended, my class came in, and each student stood by the desk that they usually sat in, now occupied by one of Bernie's students. And with great solemnity, I announced that we were going to give him the Stockman of the Year award. With bated breath, we waited, the students waited. What was the Stockman of the Year? Having the fattest ass in town. But that still did not make up for the Hannah Arendt. But I must say that while his life, his journey has come to an end, my guess is that toward the end he remembered that and thought that there might be a phone call from me that would make up for it. Fun was very much a part of Bernie's life, and you can see in the expression on his face the laughter that was part. It wasn't always laughter at other people, although the Hannah Arendt case certainly was. It was laughter at himself. The self-deprecation was part of his complexity. But Bernie did not keep his friendship limited. One of the interesting things of Bernie's life was the way that friendship expanded from him. Certainly, relationship with his wife and his son and something that he shared with the rest of us. But especially I want to highlight and lift up the relation of Bernie and Linda, Dick and Karen Kitchener, Dave and Eddie Crocker. Meeting many times together over the years, sharing achievements and disappointments. and extending the notion of friendship with me to my family, to Eddie and me as a couple, to our kids, Kathy and Amanda and Davy, all received support from Bernie in whatever they were doing. My son has workout equipment in his garage that Bernie recommended, even though he's been suffering from chronic fatigue syndrome for many years. Our girls all got support in their journeys in life. That is an important part of Bernie's life, expanding the notion of friendship from family to family and encouraging people to have a broader conception of friendship. The second thing I want to say about Bernie, apart from being a true Aristotelian friend, is that he helped us develop an approach to philosophy. You've heard bits and pieces of that today that is really, I think, revolutionary and something that the philosophy department and Colorado State can be proud of. In different ways, Holmes Ralston, Dick Kitchener, other members of the department. In my own case, ethics and international development was the topic that I tried to do what Bernie was doing with animal rights. An important part of this approach was starting out as what Bernie was a master of, being a crap detector. Calling attention to hypocrisy, especially crap detector in relation to ethics, because ethics can also stand for a moral camouflage that makes people feel good about themselves, but they keep on doing the bad old stuff. Starting with crap detection, finding out that the dog that he had taken to the veterinary experts at CSU was misdiagnosed, and he went into the library and found out that they didn't know what the hell they were talking about. That kind of crap detecting Holmes Ralston tried to do with respect to ethics of the environment, and I've tried to do with respect to the notion that international development that talks a good game about helping people often brings about more harm than good. But that also requires an articulation of moral norms, something that most people are afraid to do, especially because they get so easily misused. It also requires, in Bernie's case, a very complex kind of application to institutions, like the practice of experimental work in CSU's veterinary medicine program. But also application with respect to the norms that everyday people have, which needs to be taken seriously because many of them are devoted to animals, but get all balled up with other kinds of norms and not given the kind of help that they need. One of the influences of Bernie on my family was his love of horses. And my 85-year-old wife today, every Thursday, goes to Maryland Therapeutic Riding and has horseback riding for an hour. And you know what I gave her instructor at the end of the year? Bernie's book on equine welfare. Another application of philosophy here, of applied ethics, is to the law, and we've seen how Bernie had a role in changing the law. Ethics is not the same as law, and we have to ask what good is law and when should laws be changed, just like when should norms be changed, including the filibuster. So we have a complex approach here of starting with crap, articulating values, applying them in different ways, and finally applying them to our own lives, to the obligations each of us have to stop the evil that we're involved in, to promote the good that is possible. Like many here, I miss Bernie. But I know that the spirit of crap detection, articulation, application, institutional change will live on, and that not only human beings, but the animal world will benefit from it.
Thank you, Dave. So next is Keith Bell.
Good afternoon. My name is Keith Belk. I'm the head of the Department of Animal Sciences. Our condolences to the entire family for the loss of Bernie. Bernie was a good friend for a long, long time. I conducted my undergraduate degree here at CSU in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and was one of the chosen few in animal sciences at the time that got to take one of the first classes that Bernie taught to our students. And you could say that at the time, for a lot of us that grew up in rural Colorado that had sort of animal science roots, that it was an eye-opening experience. And I'll never forget having the opportunity to have Bernie teach us how to explore our own minds and to consider things that we had taken for granted as a correct or appropriate way of doing things, and rethinking all of those production schemes. And from that vantage point, Bernie has had, I can't imagine the countless number of students since that point in time that have been through his tutelage and that have had the experience of sort of self-discovery themselves and learning how to better their production practices and their care and their understanding of the appropriate well-being of animals. And so, on behalf of myself, who was probably one of the first undergraduate students that had the opportunity, Linda, to take Bernie's class, and then having the opportunity since the early 1990s to be a colleague and sit on a number of graduate committees with Bernie. I'd just like to say, as many have already, thank you for giving us his time, and we will miss Bernie, so thank you.
Good afternoon. I had the pleasure of starting to work with Bernie Rollin over 30 years ago when I asked him to come or be the feature editor of the Canadian Veterinary Journal Animal Ethics column. And as you can imagine, I didn't know this man. I'd read some of his material and I was very impressed, but I didn't know him, and I called him up and I said, Dr. Rollin, here's the situation. And within 5 minutes, he was yelling at me and cursing And I said, look, if this isn't going to work out for you, it's okay. He said, I didn't say it wouldn't work out for me. I'm just trying to explain a few things to you here. And I said, I think we're going to get along just fine. And that was over a 30-year relationship, and it extended well beyond that veterinary journal. Livestock producers respect and value honesty and strength. And livestock producers all over the world respected Bernie Rollin. Bernie told me a story early on about when he was at Colorado State, and he hadn't been here too long, and he was going out to ranch country to speak in the evening to whatever community beef ranchers meeting they were having that night. And he got introduced as the Jewish kid from the Jewish philosopher from Brooklyn who was going to tell him all about animal welfare. And he said he walked up on the podium and everyone started booing. And he said there were a lot of big boys out there. There were some big cattle ranchers, and he'd never stood up at a podium and just instantly was booed. And he said he just gripped that podium, his knuckles were white, and he could feel the adrenaline running through them, and they were angry and stomping their feet. And he waited till it got quiet, and then he said, look, he said, you're right. I don't know anything about cattle farming, and I am from New York, and I am in the philosophy department. And he said, I don't argue about any of that, but here's one thing I can tell you. One thing I know is that if people don't want to listen to you, no point in talking to them. So I'm leaving. You can get on with your meeting, and I won't bother you anymore about this. But he said, just if anybody's curious about what I was going to talk about, he said, I just asked you this one theoretical question. If Colorado State University came up with some research that showed that sticking red-hot needles into the eyes of cattle would get them to grow faster, would you do it? And he said they just erupted again with, you idiot, you don't know anything about cattle farming, we would never do that, who do you think we are, what kind of people do you think we are, you don't understand, you're from New York, you don't understand anything. He said, good. He said, just in case you were wondering, he said, if anybody's wondering, and I'm leaving now, but he said, we probably agree on most things, he said. And he said, then they got real quiet, and then they said, why don't you go ahead and speak? And Bernie told me that he said it was supposed to be a 45-minute talk, but after 2 hours, the adrenaline was starting to wear off, and he felt his blood glucose dropping, and all he could see were the cookies in the back of the room. And he knew he was losing focus, so he said, I got a long drive home. I think we're going to wrap it up. You got a meeting to go on after this, but thank you. And he walked off, and he headed off into the parking lot, community center in Nowhere, Colorado, and he could hear people walking in behind him. And he looked over his shoulder, and he said, there were 4 of the biggest guys in that room were coming right after me. He said, and he started walking a little faster, and he could hear those boots coming a little faster. He said, I didn't want to run because that'd be a little embarrassing, but I picked it up pretty good, and I knew I should get my back to the car because if there's a bunch of them, you don't want them jumping you from behind. And so he said he got to the car and he turned around, and 4 of the biggest guys were standing there. And they said, Doc, I tell this story to students, and I still can't get through it too easy. They said, Doc, we were wrong. We came out here to apologize. And he said, we never should have treated you like that, and you can come back here anytime you want. And you can't turn a room like that unless you're Bernie Rollin. You cannot turn a room like that unless you're Bernie Rollin. And he did that in Ontario for me on several occasions when he spoke at meetings. And when I heard that he had passed, I sent emails to many people who were his fans, including several swine farmers. That's primarily who I work with. And so I'm just going to read a small part of an email that I got in return from a pork producer that knew Bernie. He said, and this is about a meeting that Bernie spoke at. When I first heard him introduced, there was the usual PhD this and PhD that. It tells me nothing about the person. But the part of that introduction included, he rides a Harley and he's a competitive weightlifter. That caught my attention. I could see that he was very strong. Pig farmers notice these things. As I sat there waiting for Bernie to get into his presentation, I was already viewing him as someone I wanted to hear. With that bushy beard, that burly physical appearance, and possibly a Harley parked outside, he stood out from the usual guest speakers before he said anything. Later, my wife and I had the honor to sit with Bernie and have lunch and a discussion. As is often pointed out, Bernie was very kind. There was a man who had been around the world, spoke to many big shots, but he sat there and listened respectfully to this pig farmer. He became one of my inspirations to do better, and so our new loose housing, straw-based sow gestation barn was built. Bernie eventually made it back to Ontario and came to see the new barn. We loved the barn, but what would Bernie think? He loved it too, and that pleased us greatly. Over the years, we exchanged emails with Bernie and saw him a few times. He has always been an inspiration for us. I'll remember him as a no-nonsense guy, someone who could get his message across and hold his own with, or even humiliate if necessary, the smartest people in the room, or listen to and have a respectful conversation with the likes of me. I often think of him when working with my animals and wonder, what would he think of whatever it is that I'm doing? Well, actually, I probably know. It's just that I would prefer not to disappoint him. I think all of us who had the privilege and the honor to know Bernie and who have the privilege and honor to work with animals have to make sure that we carry on this work that Bernie did. We have a huge responsibility to keep all that work, all those publications, all that passion. We'll never fill his shoes. Nobody's ever going to fill his shoes again. But we can each do our part to carry on that message. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Next is Jeff.
So about 32 years ago, as a PhD student at Texas A&M, I was introduced to Bernie, and he took me under his wing, and I've always been appreciative of that. I'm sure that many students have been that same appreciative of his unselfishness and a mentor. So it's been greatly appreciated. When I think about Bernie, I smile large. And when I think about how he lived his life, I smile extra large. And speaking of smiles, I got to relate one story. I was able to reconnect with Bernie when I moved back here, or moved to Fort Collins as the state 4-H director for about 12 years, so I was able to reconnect with him, which I really appreciated that. And so one of the days we reconnected was on a 4th of July backyard cookout at my house. I invited Linda and Michael and Bernie over and some other friends, and the ribs were great. And after the ribs were all gone, Bernie started regaling us with all these professional stories of his professional life, and they were great stories, amazing stories. Most of them we can't tell here tonight. But that went on for 2 or 3 hours, and finally Michael pulled me to the side. Remember I said it was 4th of July, and his birthday is on the 4th of July. He pulled me to the side and says, "Man, I'm sorry, but I got to go." He said, "This is my birthday, and there's people in Denver waiting for me to come to my birthday party. I was supposed to have been there a long time ago." But he said I couldn't leave because I hadn't heard a lot of these stories. He said, "They're great." So he finally got to hear some of those great stories that he didn't hear. We were smiling a lot that day, extra large we were smiling. It was a great day. And speaking of smiles, after I heard about Bernie's passing, I sat down and wrote a poem about a certain smile that he had. And apparently the guy from AHA understands what smile I'm talking about. There you are. And I've tried to find one of those smiles on these slides, and I don't see it anywhere, because it's a different kind of smile. And so I decided to put that different kind of smile into some words. So let me share those words with you. It's called The Smile. I've seen it many times over the course of years and miles. A devilish, ta-da, what you think about that kind of smile? Is that it? You got it. Like the first time you ever walked into his workspace. A life's work stacked deep with not a piece out of place. As he slides his key into the knob of the door, he asks, have you ever been to my office before? And he'd flash that smile. Because anybody that's been in his office knows what I'm talking about. He'd flash that smile in a room full of people seeking answers. Also with scholars, students, and crusty old ranchers. The smile was a good sign with passion abrim that his message was received by them. That smile and those eyes framed with that wiry beard has shocked and awed many just before they cheered. I've heard many students say he was more than just clever, avowing in all their college life his was the best class ever. As sides fight each other, causing issues to boil and spew, this man caused people to see the world from another's point of view. And yes, in all the years and all the miles, nothing was greater to see than a Bernie Rollins smile. Appreciate the opportunity to share that. Thank you.
Bernie and I took a little pride in that we were the only philosophers that were UDPs, and we went to the gym more often than anybody else. And when we got to the gym, I could jog, and Bernie wanted to lift weights. Bernie said, I can just do a quarter of a mile, and then I want to push weight. And I said, I can't push weight, but I can run further than a quarter of a mile. Bernie at his prime could lift more weight, push more weight than any football players that he worked out with. I, in my time, on the Moby Field, ran 1.5 times the circumference of the earth. So I guess we both were in good shape. We had lockers very close together, and we would dress, undress, go to the gym, come back, go to the shower. And we 40 years maybe of that. You know, things look different when you're talking to each other about philosophy and you're stark naked. Bernie was concerned about the welfare of pigs. And I said to Bernie one day, pigs? Aren't you Jewish? Think about it, Bernie. We said, yeah, but they keep pigs in confined containers. Pigs need to roam. They need to nurse piglets. He was teaching veterinary medicine. In those days, the vets, in order to give students something to practice on, would break a horse's leg to give students practice setting it. And Bernie said, well, maybe once. And the vet said, oh, we break all 4 legs. And he said, well, did you get the horses set back right? And he said, well, we got a lot of limping horses around. Well, of course, Bernie talked them into stopping that. Bernie said animals have a telos, an end of good of their own, and we need to respect that end. And he said farmers, he's interested largely in domestic animals, should rear animals with regard to their telos. Well, what's a telos? Well, it's a good of their own. And Bernie said we should think of ourselves as having a contract with these animals. Yes, we're going to eat them, but we ought to take as good a care as we can so that they enjoy life before we eat them. Bernie and I once had a debate, and Dave Crocker, I think, maybe was at that debate. And we got into a discussion about valuing animals. But Bernie said there's no intrinsic value in nature. Well, I was out hiking, looking around to find new kinds of mosses. I found nobody else at CSU knew anything about mosses, so I decided, well, I might as well be the one who knows something about mosses. So I was looking for endangered species of mosses, and Bernie said to me once, that's stupid. Mosses don't have any value. Once in Ngorongoro Crater in Africa, I watched 3 lionesses kill a zebra, stalked it and killed it over a period of about 45 or 50 minutes. Well, we stayed on, and there it's a splendid place to see wild animals. We were looking for a rhino who had a calf, and we found it toward dark, and I wanted to see it better, and the guide said, no, we've got to get out of here. We've got to get back to the rim of the crater. And I said, well, why? And he said, well, after dark, they presume you're a poacher and shoot poachers. I said, well, maybe we better get back up on the rim. I asked Bernie once, would it be all right to shoot people poaching rhinos? And he said, well, ought to be a better way to work that out, but I guess if you had to, I might let you shoot a poacher. But then he said, that's an animal that we have to be concerned about caring for animals. And he looked at me and said, you wouldn't shoot anybody poaching mosses, would you? And I said, Bernie, with some jest, you wouldn't want to let me find you trashing out mosses in the Rawa wilderness after dark. Bernie died, we might say, lifting weights. He had a heart attack while he was lifting weights, a heart attack from which he never fully recovered. In the great beyond, let's hope Bernie might still be lifting weights and saving pigs. Thank you.
Thank you, Hall. So next is Ron Kendall.
So I met Bernie when I was an undergrad at CSU here in the late 80s. And in all classes, it was honors biology. I'm like, why do we have a philosopher in honors biology? I'm still not sure. But I remember his courses, and I remember him talking about stuff, and I remember it all going over my head. And then I got into vet school and had to take his class again. Basically, the same thing happened. But in my class, I think a lot of people have said, like, the one thing that he made you do was he made you think. And I really appreciate that from him. And after I graduated, I left. It took me a while to get back here. But in 2008, I was able to come back, and I interviewed for my position. And I'm a lab animal vet. So, and I was shocked that Bernie wasn't on the search committee, because of all things, I would think he would want that. Turns out he couldn't make the committee meeting, so I dodged that bullet on the interview. But when I got hired onto here, we also have a residency program in comparative medicine, lab animal medicine, and he was meeting with the residents, and he was in our break room, and he was telling the story of that everybody else has shared about how he went to the Cattlemen's Association and had these discussions with them, and at the end of the day, they all agreed with him about his ideas. And all I kept thinking was like, good gravy, this is 20 years has passed, and that's the same story he told me in vet school. Like, Bernie, you need new material. But, you know, I kind of got that from him, and then later on, he went to one of our national meetings with the lab animal group. And again, you know, it was one of those things where he was able to articulate the need for the ethical treatment of animals used in research. And again, this is a group of my peers, and there aren't too many of us who would disagree with him on that. And to make that a point, when I came and became the director of the residency program, we made our residents take his philosophy course, and boy, did they hate me for that. I heard a lot of things about Bernie after that, but I still think at the end of the day, they're better for it, and it makes them think about their values and what we're doing. Bernie most definitely had a profound impact on veterinary medicine and research animal welfare that continues today. As Colin said, he was one of the authors of the 1985 amendment to the Animal Welfare Act that not only introduced animal care and use committees, but probably more importantly, it introduced the idea that if you're going to do something that's painful and distressful to animals, you got to pay attention to that and you got to relieve it. And again, that is kind of what the crux of that committee does. And every day globally, lab animal vets and cooks are wrestling with that. So while we disagreed on a number of things, and many might even consider me his antithesis, but we both strived for the common goal of improving the welfare of research animals. And while we often approach that from opposite ends of the spectrum, we were coming to a common goal. And he made that very evident to me. I finally broke down and bought one of his books, and I asked him to sign it. And he signed it. He signed it towards a common goal with friendship. And so he has left many of us. He's really improved the advocacy of animals in research, and in friendship will continue that advocacy. Thanks.
Thank you, Lon. So we invite Neil Petrie next. We heard Lon, it was
He's working again here. Well, I'm going to take you way back for just a minute. My name is Neil Petrie, and I'm retired from the CSU English department. 53 years ago, I moved to Fort Collins to take a teaching position. Classes had not yet begun, and new faculty were moving into their offices. Mine was located in the basement of the Eddy building. New arrivals from English, foreign languages, and philosophy in those days were all intermingled in the depths of Eddy. On this particular August morning, I was getting acclimated to my office and exploring my immediate surroundings. I had just met Jacques Rioux, who occupied the office directly opposite of mine. And the door at the end of the hallway, Jacques and I had been talking, the door at the end of the hallway opened, and two figures approached. A slightly rumpled, heavy-set young man with curly black hair and beard, wearing jeans, boots, and a white t-shirt. He ambled towards me, and he was accompanied by a large, formidable black Great Dane. This was my first meeting, and I'll have to apologize ahead of time. As I've gotten older, I've become much less able to control my emotions, so I'll try to get through this anyway. This was my first meeting with a recent philosophy PhD from Columbia named Bernie. The well-trained guard attack dog was named Helga. This pair were not exactly what I had expected in the basement of Eddy. But it was a most pleasant surprise to find that the man who would occupy the office next to mine was friendly, effusive, and an extremely bright Easterner who was eager to embrace CSU and Colorado culture to the max.
This was all before the horseback and motorcycle riding, before taking up a student's challenge to join him in the athletic department weight room. I'm doing your thing in your class. Why don't you come do my thing in the gym weight room? That was Bernie's start at weightlifting. The student, as I recall, was a football player, and Bernie did most of his working out in the athletic weight room. So, this was also before the many books, before the interest in animal rights and veterinary ethics, before the confrontations with ranchers and congressional committees, before all these milestones of his brilliant career. At this stage of his life, Bernie was eager for a new life and maybe slightly disappointed that downtown Fort Collins contained sidewalks instead of boardwalks. Some of you may remember that. He was hoping for an anti-New York, a Wild West environment, and he had to work hard to create his own version of his dream. He and Linda have always lived out of town with some acreage and a stream of animals. I no longer remember what our initial conversation was like, but I remember very clearly thinking the following things. CSU would be a fine place to work with people like Bernie around. I immediately sensed that this slightly eccentric philosopher would become a great asset to CSU, to Colorado, and the academic community. I also knew instinctively that he would become not only an esteemed colleague, but one of the best friends I've ever had. During the last 2 years, I have been grieving the loss of the two smartest men I have known in my relatively long life. Notice I say men, I've also known some very smart women. But among men, the smartest include my elder brother, who was another philosopher who shifted into a more pragmatic career. And certainly Professor Bernard Rollin, the man I first met 53 years ago, and who has departed far too early from us. Somewhere in some old box of old photos, there is a picture of my son at 3 or 4 years of age. He was sitting astride a very tolerant, large black dog. I miss Helga too.
Thank you very much, Neil. Next is Professor Whitlock.
Wade, Bernie, give me a call when you can. Thanks. Bye. That was often left on my answering machine. And I treasure that because it was Bernie being Bernie. My relationship with Bernie, and ostensibly through Linda, because they were always close, and then Michael as well. Clearly, the family was important. Was in 1977 or 78, when I was on the football team, and I was a gym rat, living in the weight room. And then the weight room wasn't anything like it is today. It was a cleared out event storage space where they stored the chairs for concerts and things in Moby Gym, as it was known then. And so it was in the bowels of Moby Gym. And I got to meet Bernie lifting weights on a regular basis. And the descriptions are totally correct. And I have to challenge Holmes because I had the bench press record. And maybe it was, I think I could beat Bernie then, but Bernie kept on lifting. So he might have surpassed my bench press record, but getting to know Bernie in the weight room was a true pleasure. And it was really the beginning of a friendship that continued to his passing. Bernie and I would have conversations regularly about just the university and campus life and being a Willard Eddy hire and forming then the college, the liberal arts, and the Department of Philosophy, very formidable times of this university. Tom Edling spoke, and we did a project together with Petco at the time, but it was hyperbaric hypoxia, a more humane way of euthanizing rodents. If you think about it, Petco has to feed a lot of rodents to snakes and things. You can't medicate them in any way, so what's a humane way of rodents? Actually, there's a company called Gourmet Rodent out there. But we came up with a more humane way using hyperbaric hypoxia. And so my role in this thing was the engineering. And so I'd have graduate student design the equipment to meet the requirements. And Terry Engel was a key part, and Lynn Kiesel was a part of that as well as Tom. And then also I saw Ralph Schweitzer, and we did an initial concept with Optobrand. Basically, instead of physically harming the animal to uniquely identify it, was looking at its retina and coming up with a unique pattern from birth to death of the animal to uniquely identify that animal. And we came up with a prototype concept for that. So working with Bernie was always a pleasure. And Bernie, he was gruff, but also he had the biggest heart for students. And I was so fortunate that my son got his first degree in philosophy here at Colorado State, and Bernie was an advisor in that. And working together, I asked Bernie, and Holmes Ralston, philosophy of the environment, nature, and Bernie, philosophy of animal ethics. I said, being a land-grant university, we've touched on the Department of Natural Resource, or the College of Natural Resource. We've touched on vet med biomedical sciences. What about engineering? I said, why isn't there a philosophy of engineering? There's philosophy of science. There's engineering ethics that we teach in terms of ethical decision making. But what about philosophy of engineering? And he thought that was interesting, and we had numerous conversations with that, including with my son as a philosophy undergrad, and having the philosophy chops to actually bring some understanding to that. And we, one of the last things before COVID was we threatened to teach a class together on the philosophy of engineering. And if you think about it, there's hypothesis-driven reductionism, science, on one hand, and engineering is design-based synthesis on the other hand. Really different concepts. And there's no basis for pinning engineering. So anyway, that's a continuation that I have with Bernie. And it's a real joy to think about that. It's been mentioned in numerous ways, but the strong family that Bernie had with Linda and Michael and so forth. But I always viewed Bernie as a study in contrast. And Rick pointed out really is comfortable at the full spectrum of the contrast, whether it's weightlifting, whether it's the philosopher, Harley writer, the heart for students, but less so for administrators. He was an innovator, a collaborator. He was curious and challenging. Bernie was a great man, and it was just a blessing to work with him. Thank you very much.
It's fun to be able to follow Wade. Good friends for a long time. My name's Matt Hickey. My home college is Health and Human Sciences. I've had the pleasure of having a joint appointment in vet med and BMS, what used to be called physiology for the old timers in the crowd for many years. And I had the pleasure of knowing and working closely with Bernie for almost 25 years. And I'm happy to be able to call him teacher and mentor and collaborator and above all things friend, right? I used to joke with Bernie that we met over a biopsy needle, right? So, when I was a new hire, my first fall here, I brought a new technique. We would biopsy humans instead of animals, as it turns out, as a research tool, and we wanted to get that approved by the IRB, and so I invited myself to an IRB meeting, and Bernie was there. Right after that meeting, he reached out to me, and this was my first lesson in one of the abiding attributes of Bernie Rollin, which is his generosity of spirit. He reached out and said, Matt, can we talk? And Bernie embarked on a somewhat quixotic 20-year effort to get me to think, right? And the jury's still out, but Linda, I'm working on it. And I'm happy to say, when I do so on a daily basis, I bear Bernie's fingerprints, and I'm happy to do so. He's had a profound influence on me. We served together on the IRB for many years. I chaired that committee for many years. I was happy as part of my tutelage under Bernie's wing to serve as his alternate on the Animal Care and Use Committee. And I was smart enough to actually go while he was in town, not just when he was away at meetings, so that I could continue to learn from him. For the last 10 years, I've been able to teach a class in biomedical ethics that I would never have taught had Bernie not reached out after that first visit to the IRB meeting. And the highlight of every semester was inviting Bernie to come join me, and we would discuss animal welfare ethics in front of those students. And as has been alluded to over the last series of 3-minute talks, Bernie had a colorful vocabulary, right? And so as I was prepping the students for the visit by this distinguished professor, I would always just allude to the fact that, you may hear some things that are not technical academic jargon coming from Dr. Rollin, but I would say no more. I would then just sit back and watch as he would enter the classroom and do his thing. And they loved it, and they loved him. And Wade pointed this out, and so many others have as well. He loved his students. He poured into them. I'm thankful as a student of sorts of his that he was willing to pour into me. I appreciate it very much. As I thought about this, there's so many things one could bring to mind about what do I like about Bernie the most, but I'll just put forward two, and they really echo Wade's observations. One is his great love, Linda, for you, and Michael, for you, and how naturally and consistently that would pour out of him. Whenever we had an opportunity to talk about the family, I would just sit back and bask in the glow. And as a young parent, that again left an impression upon me. So Bernie's mentoring can extend well beyond sort of academic domains. The second thing, and we haven't yet touched on this today, but Bernie for, again, 20 plus years would make this observation to me. We heard a great deal today, and rightly so, about Bernie's capacious intellect. He was widely read, he was a great conversationalist, he was a powerful thinker, and I think no matter, again, where you stood, your thinking was sharpened by those interactions with him. But for 20 plus years, he would always point out to me that Linda was the smart one of the bunch. He had a deep and abiding respect and a deep and abiding love for his wife and his family, and that is the treasure that I will take with me as I continue to appreciate and strive to be more like our dear friend Bernie. So thank you for a few minutes. I appreciate it.
Hello, everybody. I may be the least distinguished speaker here today, but I've had the honor of knowing Bernie my whole life. Be emotional too, sorry. As Bernie and Linda were friends of my parents, are friends of my parents since 1973, which is an impressive run from friendship. My parents are Joan and Kevin Keene. Some of you probably know them. They couldn't be here today because of my dad's health, but they send their love. I wanted to share a fun personal story if I could. After I was born, my good Irish Catholic parents had me baptized at John the 23rd Catholic Parish, and then they had a baptismal ceremony and party for me and invited all their friends and family and said, just come, meet the baby, celebrate with us, don't worry about bringing gifts. Well, Bernie and Linda arrived, and they arrived with a gift. And my mom said, oh, you didn't have to. And Bernie looked sternly at her like he often did when he was serious and said, no good Jewish godfather meets a baby without a gift. And so my mom graciously accepted and was grateful for it and opened it right then. And inside was a tiny pink ruffly dress. And in maybe a sexist assumption, she turned to Linda and said, oh my gosh, thank you so much, it's beautiful. And Linda said, oh, don't look at me, Bernie picked it out. And it's such a cherished thought for us, Bernie in the department store, in the little baby girl section, making sure he was picking the perfect little pink ruffly dress. He has been the best atheist Jewish godfather that a good Catholic girl could have asked for. Throughout my life, he was my unofficial advisor here at CSU. My son is now a sophomore here, and one of my only regrets is that he doesn't have Bernie's office to go to. So much love to you guys. Much love to you, Bernie. Thank you.
I have enjoyed these pictures, Linda. And I love the ones where you're younger. It's nice to see the ones. I would have loved to have seen more of those. I simply want to share that when I worked in the Department of Philosophy for 7 years, I pretty much spoke with Bernie every day, unless he was traveling. I enjoyed our conversations, and I loved hearing about the meetings he had with different groups on campus and off campus, and the versatile group of people that he associated with. I worked in the front office. There were only 2 staff members, so anything that wasn't HR or accounting landed on my desk, including projects from Bernie. And I remember the first time he gave me something to type, as it was in his handwriting on yellow pad paper, and I could barely read it. And I was like, are you kidding me? Are we not in the computer age? I couldn't believe these scribbly yellow pads. But eventually I got accustomed to his writing, and we submitted many articles, weekly, monthly, etc., to all the places that he had obligations. And rarely was there not yellow sheets of paper in my inbox. I enjoyed reading his submissions. Initially, I would type the words and then go back and proof them and give them to Bernie, and he would return them with the edits. And then we would have a clear copy to send wherever we needed to send them. And at that point, that was when I actually could read it for content, because before I was just trying to comprise it together and get it submitted. And then I would read it, and we would continue discussions, and I've always been an animal advocate, so it was just lovely to work with Bernie and to be supportive in that respect, and to have a significant place and a piece and a contribution to what he did on a larger scale. We've all talked about all the publications. Somebody had to type those. That was me. For a while. I loved Bernie, I loved his humor, and I always felt that there was a mutual respect. And even after I left the department, we corresponded off and on by email, and he was always supportive and genuine. And I considered him a friend, although our worlds were not similar in many aspects. But going back to the time that I did spend in philosophy, Bernie mentioned one day that he was going to write another book. And shortly after that statement, he handed me chapter 1. And I'm like, are you kidding me, an entire book? And yes, and so I started typing. He gave me a complimentary copy. And in those pages, after all of his acknowledgments, and before the reference and index pages, he wrote, last but not least, Brittany Merritt, who was our work study person at the time who helped me, thank God, and Joyce Beth Emanuel, typist extraordinaire, for turning handwritten gibberish into intelligible typescript. I still have some of those pages. I have some of those yellow pages. I have some of the rough drafts with Bernie's writing. And they're truly a treasure. And this is probably the only time that my name's going to be in a publication. But it was Bernie's book, and that is really one of the great memories that I have of him. Thank you.
I think I'm the last one, so, but what a great honor to be here and to remember Bernie. My first meeting with Bernie Rollin was unusual and somewhat intimidating. I came to CSU in late 1979, and in 1980 I was on rounds with the students in the barn, and this short, squat, bearded man came forward like he wanted to pick a fight. And I thought he was capable of such, and he introduced himself then as Bernie Rollin, and he wanted to talk about my research grant that I'd recently submitted to the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. And with use of a few words that we can't mention, told me what he thought of that research grant, and summoned me to come meet with him in his office the next day or whenever I could. So I went to the office and I got a lesson, and I was fresh out of a PhD at Purdue. I thought I knew it all, and it was very clear that he didn't think so. But it started a relationship that was really special. And surprisingly, a few weeks later, he called up and he said, "I'd like you to join the IACOC." And I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah, I think you could help it." So I started going to the IACOC meetings, and it was really interesting because this is 1980, and really some of the research projects, when it comes down to animal welfare, were shocking to me. And I was expressing surprise, and being from New Zealand, we're pretty blunt over there too, so I was pretty blunt in my assessments. Not in quite the same language as Bernie, but close at times. And I found that we had a lot of synchrony in how we thought, and he certainly taught me a lot. Because my surgical caseload in the hospital was fairly high, I couldn't make all the meetings, and so after a couple of years, I requested to be off the committee, but Bernie still came, and when he had a research grant that was equine and he wanted to discuss, he'd come and we'd philosophize about it. I was quite humbled when he asked me to write co-author a book on equine welfare that he'd been invited to do back in probably 2019. And it further impressed my respect and affection for Bernie. Now, he had a different modus operandi for team writing a book. He would like to philosophize about the authors and the chapters, and I had to do all the editing. But and he had one author he was particularly fond of, who wrote very long chapters, and so but we got through it. And in the preface, I wanted to read to you what we wrote in the preface, because I think it summarizes not only the relationship that Bernie and I had, but the relationship Bernie had with many people in the veterinary school. This book has grown out of a 30-year collegial and friendship relationship between the two editors, one of us an equine surgeon and researcher, and the other a philosopher focused on animal ethics. Our extensive history of watching yesterday's acceptable practices turn into today's social issues, combined with our close tracking of equine welfare concerns, convinced us of the timeliness, indeed exigency, of such a book. I think this sums up our friendship and partnership. Now, back to the personal interactions. I don't think I ever won an argument with Bernie. And he'd force you into submission, sometimes due to time or sometimes bringing up various other things, but they were fun. But one day, I got exasperated with him. He called me on the phone, and he was very concerned about a project they were doing on pigs. And he said, they're burning these pigs without pain medicine. And I said, really? And I said, do you mean they're doing laser studies on the skin? He said, yes. And there's no analgesia. I said, are these pigs anesthetized? He said, yes. And I said, well, Bernie, I can tell you that anesthesia gives you pain relief. You can't feel pain. And when pigs feel pain, you know about it. It's easily heard. And he said, well, that's not the case in humans. So we went off into this thing where, you know, as I pointed out to him, I said, yeah, some humans, particularly when they're elderly, they're anesthetic risks, and so they get some muscle relaxant, which can potentially paralyze them, and you've got to get the formula right. But I said, I can assure you that if pigs feel pain, you know about it. Well, he went on, and he wouldn't give up on it. So I said, Bernie, I've got a horse on the table. That's code for an excuse that I need to get off the phone. I used it with a lot of people. Not just Bernie, but I only used it with Bernie one time, this time. And I said, look, I've got to go. And he kept talking. I said, Bernie, I'm going to hang up on you if you don't stop, because we're getting nowhere. And he kept talking, so I hung up. And a minute later, the phone goes, and my assistant answers it. Dr. Rollin's on the phone. He said, did you hang up on me? And he wasn't mad, he wasn't angry. I never saw him angry, but he was shocked that I would hang up on him, because he was always in the mode, you know, when he was into those kicks. So the funny story was, we talked, and then finally we hung up. And I didn't hear from him for about 3 weeks, and then he called me up. He says, hey, it's Bernie. I said, hi, Bernie, how's it going? He said, I think Tony's pissed off with me. Tony Frank, the president. And I said, well, what happened? He said, well, I called him about this pig project where they're burning them. And I said, you don't remember our conversation? And it was like that. It would go over the top. He didn't take anything personally, And he apparently hadn't remembered or hadn't decided they were worth listening to. So you'll always have those moments but he was more seriously worried that Tony wasn't happy either. So the loss is huge, and to many others within the CSU community and worldwide, it's huge to them as well. Fortunately, he wrote a lot down. You've seen the books being discussed. So we have a permanent legacy of his leadership in animal welfare and ethics, because he's got no equal, he has no equal, and I don't think he ever will. Thank you.
So now we invite the mic.
Well, I've had a lifetime to prepare for this, and I probably started looking forward to it off and on when I was a teenager, but and yet I have nothing prepared. I mean, because you know, and you all know the guy, so you all know the relationship we had, and so, you know, I could have been talking this entire time about my dad and still keep going. So, but it's funny because he would always, so whenever he did a lecture, which he did, you know, thousands around the world, he would always have a manuscript prepared. He'd always have it. Sometimes he would practice it. And every single time he would get up, he would like read the first paragraph, and then he would, you know, put the manuscript aside and just, you know, ad lib. And every single time, you know, he would come back and be like, you know, I started reading, and then I threw the manuscript away, as though it was the first time. He did it thousands of times. He did this, and every single time it was like he was doing it the first time. So I'm doing the same thing. I just didn't actually bring the manuscript that I wasn't going to use anyway. There's, like I said, so much I could say. But I think I want to take this opportunity to really focus on two things. One, Neil, when you were talking about him being disappointed that they had sidewalks and not boardwalks, I think you are really on the head with that. He grew up watching Westerns, and I think he wanted to be a gunslinger, and I think he was a gunslinger. And he was a lawman. He had the fastest gun in the West because he had the fastest mind in the West. He had the law on his side, and the law was truth, universal truth, which is suffering is bad, and we should do what we can to lessen suffering whenever we can. Inarguable. It's the law. Find me somebody who could argue against that idea. And so he would go from town to town and group to group and lay down the law and remind people, like a number of people said, that they already know this law. And cross him, and he'll meet you at high noon. And that was no bullshit. He absolutely would on anything, and he cared more. Whatever it was, if he cared about it, he cared more than everybody else. And that was part of his being a lawman too, was that, you know, he became the sheriff here, as I think a lot of people here have acknowledged. You know, whatever you were doing, if he wasn't gonna put a stamp of approval on it, you knew it wasn't gonna happen, regardless of how absolutely certain you were about what you thought you were doing right. If he didn't buy it, it wasn't going to happen. So I enjoy thinking of him with his with spurs jingling each time he walked away from a crowd or a meeting or any of these interactions. You know, anybody who knows him knows, you know, as a bunch of people have mentioned, you know, was never forgotten in all his endeavors. I was always kind of right at the center of the world, and I could talk for hours about that. You know, and I think I got from him most of the good things about my personality. Probably most of the bad things about my personality are all kind of directly stem from him. He was, like a couple people said, I think, a study in contradictions. He was in on it. I mean, he knew this, but didn't find much need to resolve it. I also think he didn't quite. He was meaner than he knew, and he was kinder than he knew. He was more scared than he was ever willing to acknowledge, and he was always more resilient than he realized to the end. He taught me everything about questioning everything, not buying into dogma, not taking shit, standing up for what you believe in, being loyal. And he did that pretty explicitly. But I think with this group here, the one thing I'd really want to highlight is something that he never really taught explicitly, but that was very implicitly true in all his interactions. And that was the value he put on relationships, and as testament of all the people here right now. He, as much as he didn't care who he pissed off, and you know, if you did something he didn't approve of, you know, you were off his list. But these relationships mattered to him a ton. So in that legendary office of his, where he had, you know, the manila folders stacked 6 and 7 feet high, everywhere. I mean, it was just to the point where when the flood came in '97, nothing really moved because everything was packed in so tight. It all got wet, but it didn't move. But these stacks of hundreds of folders, each of them had somebody's name on the cover of it. And I remember being a little kid and being like, well, who are these people? And he's like, oh, it's the people that I'm doing this work for. Then when I got a little older, I was like, oh, no, well, this is for that journal, and this is for that lecture, and this is for that meeting. But it always had somebody's name on it. Because to him, whatever he was doing, even if it was on behalf of the animals, if he was given a task, it was in reference to another person who had asked it of him. And he never wanted to disappoint anybody. And he always wanted to give, you know, if you got in the door, he was going to give you everything he had. To look out, you know, at these faces, many of whom I haven't seen in decades, and you know, to sort of have these, because he was always really transparent about what was going on in his life, and who is who, and who is up to what, and everything. So you know, I've heard stories about every one of you, mostly favorable. But you know, that's a really powerful thing for me, and I think in some ways that may be even what I take the most from him, because you know, I'm a shrink now. I sort of majored in relationships and in human interaction, and you know, I think that's something that was modeled for me in a way that I could never get away from and would never want to. So my dad loved to sing all the time. He was atrocious. Actually, weirdly, after probably a little bit of a stroke somewhere later in his life, he weirdly got a bunch better briefly in the latter part of his life. I will never understand that, but he was a terrible singer, but he sang all the time. And he loved music, and you know, as everybody knows, he was a softie, and you know, could be moved very easily, and but still felt like his music had to be macho. That was, and now what counted as macho was, you know, depended on his mood, such that even Bette Midler passed muster a couple times, But so he loved folk music, and he loved Irish folk music. Much as we've been talking about Scotland, but he loved Irish folk music. He loved the Clancy Brothers, and you know, we would take trips in the car, and he would all have these Clancy Brothers tapes we would listen to over and over again. I know every word of every song. And I was about 6, I would say, and this song came on. This song called "The Parting Glass," which some of you may have heard before. And I'm 6 years old, and he's like, play this at my funeral. I'm like, well, all right, I'm 6, but I'll make a note of it. And he said it probably once a year for the next several years until, he kind of, his tastes moved on and he was listening to other stuff. But he always said, play the parting glass at my funeral, which is so funny. He didn't drink hardly at all. Maybe a little bit when he was younger, but it was, he was not that kind of guy. He did enjoy fun, but he didn't go out. He wasn't that kind of convivial guy. He was, full of life and energy, but it was intellectual and it was professional a lot of times. But he loved the song. So I figure I didn't bring a recording, so I'm gonna have to sing it. I've never sung in front of a group, but I'll probably sing it better than he did. So. For all the money that e'er I spent it in good company, and all the harm that I ever did, alas, it was to none but me. And all I've done for want of wit, to memory now I can't recall. So fill to me the parting glass. Good night and joy be with you all. For all the comrades that e'er I had, they're sorry for my going away. And all the sweethearts that e'er I had would wish me one more day to stay. But since it falls unto my lot that I should rise and you should not, I'll gently rise and I'll softly call. Good night and joy be with you all. Thanks, everybody. That really was a lot better than he would have sung it.
Thanks, everyone. I promise not to sing. That was lovely. And I didn't know Bernie loved Irish music. I can't resist a short Bernie story, and that's when I was interviewing as an assistant professor for a job here at Colorado State in 2008. I was very nervous, and I gave my job talk. And in the front row was a short guy with a big beard, boots, jeans, and a Harley-Davidson t-shirt. And he asked me the most technical question about Kant's transcendental unity of apperception. And sort of, I was like a deer in headlights. I think I answered his question appropriately, given the background. But it was probably the most astute question I received during my interview here at Colorado State. And that same day, apparently it had gotten out to him that I had started dabbling in weightlifting. And so in the hallway, after this very technical question about Kant's transcendental unity of apperception, he looked at me and said, "How much you back squat?" Clearly the answer is not very much. And I told him very sheepishly, and somehow still I got the job. So I think my answer to the Kant question probably made up for my paltry back squat numbers. So I had other things to say about Bernie, but we've heard so much about his legacy, his trailblazing work in animal ethics, his tireless advocacy for animal welfare. What I really want to emphasize is Bernie as a teacher and as a mentor. We've heard over and over again that Bernie had this huge heart, and if you could get in the door, he would do anything for you. And that was his students, that was his colleagues, that was graduate students that he worked with. He really became people's best advocate, and we didn't want to let him down, and he would let us know if we did. And so I think that's what I really take from Bernie's legacy. And I also think that Bernie really embodied the land-grant mission of this university. He was able to unite classical learning, right, and these deep roots in philosophy with really important practical and applied issues. He really embodied that no-nonsense ethos and commitment to using his intellect and his energy to make the world a better place. And it's important for us to recognize that he didn't just impact all of these human beings around him, but he positively affected the lives of millions and very likely billions of sentient beings. So that's not bad for a renowned Hume scholar. We really take seriously in the Department of Philosophy this legacy that Bernie and Dave Crocker and Holmes Ralston built around applied philosophy, taking these heights of the intellect and applying them to real-world problems. And as people have said over and over again, no one's going to fill Bernie's boots, right? And we can't hope to try to do so. But one small gesture, one small way that we can maintain and continue Bernie's legacy is that we as a department would like to inaugurate the Bernie Rollin Memorial Lecture in Animal Ethics. Thank you. And this is our recognition of Bernie's groundbreaking work and the deep need for us to continue that in some way. I do want to thank Steve Hillard, who was a longtime supporter of Bernie through the Council Tree Fund for financial support for this, and we will have our inaugural lecturer in February 2023. We will invite Dr. Claire Palmer from Texas A&M, who is a renowned animal ethicist and environmental ethicist and ethicist of emergent technologies, to come and give a public talk, to meet with students, to meet with other folks from other disciplines, and to reach out to the community, as Bernie always did. And so we really invite all of you. We're excited to share the details as they emerge, and we'd like to continue to do this on a regular basis as our small gesture to Bernie's great legacy. So thanks very much for allowing me to speak.
So next there is a short video on Bernie's life.
My first principle is you shouldn't be bored. You can't learn when you're bored.
Boredom seems barely possible in Professor Bernie Rollin's philosophy classroom at Colorado State University, where the focus is on ethics and how humans treat animals.
You know, I use a lot of humor and a lot of outrageous terminology and stuff like that.
Students learn with this university distinguished professor who created the nation's first ever veterinary medical ethics course in 1978.
Got it?
And reformed the way research animals are treated across the country through a career dedicated to compassion for all animals.
I'm not naive enough to think that everybody's going to stop using animals, you know? But if you're going to use them with compassion and use them with some sense of what their needs are.
Now, Rollin is being honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award for excellence in research ethics from an organization traditionally focused on human medicine, Primer, Public Responsibility in Medicine and Research. The award for CSU's renowned animal ethicist marks the first time ever that Primer's highest honor goes to a leader focused on the care and use of animals.
It shows that the issue is being taken seriously.
At what point does the balance start to tip and the idea of what is...
And I've said this repeatedly, veterinarians should lead the charge for animals' rights. And I quote Plato to them. They think it's the clay, you know? Plato. Plato said, any craftsman, in the broadest sense, any artisan, you know. Their job is to increase what they work on in value. A goldsmith takes $50 worth of gold and turns it into $300 worth of rings. And similarly, the job of a physician or a veterinarian is to make the object of their art better, to heal. And so, animal welfare is part of your very essence and your very mission.
At home, Rollin's care for animals focuses on his dogs, Molly and King. He knows his no-nonsense New York style, tell it like it is, doesn't always make him friends. Instead, what he gets used to hearing is,
I can't stand the son of a bitch, but he makes me think. I don't care if you like me. My son likes me. My wife likes me probably 20% of the time, and my dogs like me. What more do I need?
and with all the traveling to give speeches, writing books, and guiding public policy, all part of a lifetime of achievement, Professor Bernie Rollin finds great comfort here, talking philosophy with his students at CSU.
And I love to teach.
We'll go back to the dopamine syndrome thing.
And it's still therapeutic. If I'm depressed, if I'm sad, if I have a tummy ache, you know, you go and you start teaching, and it's a blissful experience when you have good kids, and I almost always have good kids. I have to say this, and I mean it. I've taught in a lot of places. I've lectured all over the world, and the CSU kids are the perfect student. So, I mean, I can't say enough about these kids. I love them. I just love them. So I'm blessed. I mean, I really am blessed. I get to fight for the things that can't, and I get to fight against the things that can.